so much for having me. My name is Evelyn. I work at strategic design agency 1508 in Copenhagen. And today we're going to be talking about the decoding of Generation Z and Generation Alpha. We're going to be looking at how to build an understanding of their reality, as well as how we can convert these generalizations we end up with into actionable insights. I'm very happy to be talking to you guys in Iceland, because I used to live and work in Iceland myself back in 2015. I even tried to learn your language, which is extremely beautiful and also extremely difficult. So I did what any sensible human being would do, and that is learn Danish instead. I currently live and work in Denmark. I have a background in predominantly positioning strategy, where I combine futures thinking and design thinking to create long-term solutions to business problems. So in the next 13 minutes, I'm going to be cramming a lot of information, which I hope is very useful to you. But if it were so to be that you would forget the entire talk, there are two things that I would love for you to remember. And also that I would love for us to start with, which is that we are inherently biased. That means that we go out into the world and instinctively seek out people that in some way agree with us. We go out and find information that validates our assumptions, our existing assumptions. So this is where I feel like futures thinking and design thinking is so useful, as it helps us to zoom out and zoom in into other people and other people's realities. It helps us better understand them, which helps us make better products for our consumers, as well as just simply make us more empathetic human beings. So what we're seeing, for example, is that this happens a lot with generations, right? So we're seeing younger generations simply frustrated with older generations, and older generations just not understanding younger generations. So this is a really nice way to help bridge that gap, let's say. So how to decode generations, and also why would we go and look at generations? Generations are, after all, groups of millions of people that are very hard to simply generalize and say, God, they all have this need and they all have this want and they all think the same, because we're talking about millions of individuals. So the real value of doing generational analysis is not per se to use it as a segmentation for marketing. It is more so about understanding how our worldviews change over time, and then we can start using that knowledge to build better products. We are all subjected to the same mega forces. When a global crisis hits, it affects us. We're seeing it now with the pandemic, right? Pandemic happens and we're all subjected to this. However, when we look at generations, and especially their formative years, so say from 0 to 15, there are events happening in their time that form the way that they see the world. They sometimes simply don't know any better. And there's obviously that even though we're all subjected to the same events, it still shapes us differently and how we respond to that. So this is the real value of decoding generations, is understanding their worldview. So yeah, we're seeing this line of generations, and then I blocked them out into saying, you know, these are the formative years of Gen Z, these are the formative years of Gen Alpha. And in those formative years, you see all those little dots on the screen representing different events. In trend research, these are called manifestations of change. This is anything that you can observe yourself when you look out at a restaurant, how people are behaving. It can be something you hear in a podcast or something you see on the news. It can be a patent that has been filed. There are different events that can represent a change. So what we can do is look at these different events and start scanning, selecting and documenting them, because it's a great way to uncover bigger patterns, understanding what's going on in society as a whole. So by mapping these events, we start having an overview of what is going on. I made an example here myself, also looking at it on my screen. Made an example here myself, and these can be different things. It can range from the release of the iPad to temperatures on the rise in the UK to the economic crisis in 2008. From small to big, doesn't matter, just things that you think are manifesting a certain change. When you do this for your own target group, I recommend to use also local signs, as they are going to be embedded in your local community. Right, so once we have mapped out, and this step where we're looking at the different signs is all about quantity, getting as many as you can, just different signs you think are interesting. So once you have collected all those signs, this quantity of signs, it's about interpreting them, analyzing them, clustering them in ways that are meaningful. And we do this by selecting signs, shuffling them around, uncovering what are similarities between them and what are differences between them that might not always be as obvious. So in this case, when we look at Gen Z, we can, for example, see different dots on the screen representing different events, obviously occurring in their formative years and therefore altering their view of reality. So I selected some signs of change from the early 2000s, the formative years of the Gen Z, and then clustered them into their significance in a deeper cultural shift. So for example, what we're seeing is flat sharing on the rise in the late 2000s. We're also seeing the global recession in 2008. Music is digitalizing instead of having a physical CD. It's the hottest day ever in the UK. And these things might not seem inherently related, but what a deeper cultural shift is that we're moving away from ownership. This could be because we're more conservative about our spending because of the global recessions, but it could also be because, God, the hottest day has been recorded. I might want to stop over-consuming. So the concept of status for Gen Z is much different than for example, millennials or Gen Xers, because they see status not based on what they own. They see status based more on what they contribute to society. So a great way to cluster these signals is by giving it a nice name or a catchy name, and then a short explanation of what these signs have in common. In this case, we're seeing the decline of ownership, both in private life, as we see in relationships, being not as long lasting, as well as in how we consume. So I went ahead and made a bunch of different of these analyses or trend clusters and themed them, which I encourage you to have a look at afterwards when you have the slide deck. And these are just my interpretations of the signs that I spotted. So they're subjective, but I picked out 3 of them that we can have a look at so we can have an understanding of what this generation values. For example, what we're seeing in Generation Z, much more than in previous generations, is their focus on mental health and also their openness about this. They're so open about going to therapy, for example, which was a massive taboo only 2 generations ago. What we're also seeing is that this generation grew up in a time where there was a lot of doomsday scenarios in the news. So we're seeing a leniency towards escapism in their imaginations or in their phones. We're also seeing that they are extremely frustrated with how the current systems, political systems, economic systems, how they're functioning. So we're seeing there's call from them for redesigning the systems that we currently have through grassroots movements and activism. Right, so this is already useful information in its own, and technically you could already use this later on to create actionable insights. But where I think the really interesting thing happens is when you analyze another generation as well. In this case, we're looking at generation alpha. We can see, that way we can see a change over time and understand that worldviews aren't static. So what we're seeing is that even in 15 years of a difference, and even though we might think how big could the difference be, we're already seeing that Gen Alpha is subjected to extremely different forces in their formative years than Gen Z was. Again, I selected some signs. What we're, for example, seeing is 2010 was the start of DNA editing. That doesn't mean that we now edit DNA. It just means that this became part of their reality, part of their possibility, right? We're seeing lab-grown meat. We're seeing improvement of synthetic voices. These things that might seem initially unrelated, again, signify a deeper cultural shift. For Gen Alpha, in this case, we're seeing an increasing interconnectedness or blurring of lines between what is real and what is fake, also dubbed the synthetic decades. Again, bubbles with different trend clusters. And again, encourage you to have a look at them afterwards once you have the slide deck. I selected 3, and here we can already see a massive difference with Generation Z. We're seeing, for example, that Gen Alpha is going to be growing up faster than any generation before, both biologically, but also mentally. Think, for example, about their access to information. Now that voice activation is becoming so much more normalized. The fact that you can already ask for information before you can even type it out. We're also seeing an increasingly an increased perception of scarcity of time. So Gen Z already feels like, time is running out with the climate. Imagine Generation Alpha. This means that their perception of what they prioritize to use their time on is going to be extremely different. Also, increasingly, robotics taking over jobs that were done by humans before, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. All right, so now that we've made some assumptions about these target groups, we should go out and validate them, because we can't just make these assumptions based on trends, signs, manifestations of change, clustering them, and then thinking, good, this is what they're like. We need to go out and ask them if this is true. So this is where I see the actual power of combining futures thinking with design thinking. So this is where we can combine the abstract macro environment with what people actually think. And this is how we move from generalizations to actionable insights. How to use these trend clusters to ask informed questions to your users. So we do this by selecting a trend cluster that you think is of relevance for your business. You then look at your business context, and together in the overlap, there are some issues of strategic interest. Let's just take as an example, again, scarcity of time. In 10 years, Generation Alpha will be going to university. If they feel like time is scarce, they might not want to opt for a 4-year degree. They might want to opt for a 1-year degree instead. These are assumptions that we're making that we then need to go out and validate with our users so we can provide products that they want. So you can go out and test your assumptions with your users and see, okay, how do we need to make a change? Do we need to make a change to fit with this new reality? This funnels into something that we called proof of design. We use design thinking at 1508, which is this user-centered way of developing products. So what we did just now was part of the think phase. We're saying, we're building an assumption about the users, then we're testing this with the users, and from there onward, we can think out what is the problem, what is the solution to this, right? Then we go on to the create phase, the second one here, where we start prototyping, testing, learning. We go back and forward. It's not a linear process, right? And then once we have gathered all those insights, we can start building. And the building is building to evolve, so it needs to be a product that can change over time, or at least that you have the mindset that it can change over time. Right, and that means that you end up with designing meaningful experiences, designing meaningful products, services, as well as understanding that this changes over time. It's a dynamic world we live in. All right, that was all for me. What I hope that you take away from this is understanding others or learn how to understand others, as well as understanding how things change over time, whether that is fast or whether that is slow, and how these influence your potential target group and therefore also your business. This allows you to be much more innovative over time. Anyways, I would love for you guys to add me on LinkedIn when you have the chance. Send me your feedback, your questions, or simply just drop a note or a connect. And hope to see you soon again in Iceland. Thank you so much.